Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Ted Jackson. I'm chair of the Group of 78. We're a nonprofit working for peace and disarmament, climate action, and inclusive sustainable development. This webinar will examine the recent cuts by the Government of Canada in the recent budget that was tabled in Parliament to our international assistance program. The quantum of these cuts is substantial, nearly 3 billion Canadian dollars over 4 years. And this is with a special focus on global health, and we'll come to that. Development organizations and both overseas and here in Canada are deeply concerned about these cuts. And you're going to hear from our excellent panel of experts from civil society and academia what the implications of these cuts are, both for the Global South and for Canadian development community, and what Canadians can do about this. But I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which this event is based is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, who have lived here for thousands of years at this gathering point at the confluence of three rivers. We recognize the damage perpetrated on this land and its original peoples by our colonial institutions. As a foreign policy nonprofit, we support the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. As part of our own commitment to reconciliation, the Group of 78 has much to learn and much to do in integrating Indigenous knowledge and perspectives into our own work and in working with partnership with Indigenous organizations. That's work we have to do. Okay, we're fortunate to have with us three experts who can walk us through these cuts. The bios of our panelists are available on the online poster for this webinar. You have probably seen it. Let me just quickly introduce them. Darren Seller-Peretz is a member of Cooperation Canada's policy team, where he guides the organization's government relations and leads budget advocacy efforts to strengthen the voice and impact of Canadian NGOs working in international cooperation. This year, Darren has also served as the C7 Sherpa, coordinating recommendations by civil society to G7 leaders. Megan Aikens is the Director of Policy and Partnerships at the Canadian Partnership for Women and Children's Health, or CanWaCH, where she provides strategic direction, issues management, and stakeholder engagement to advance the priorities of CanWaCH and its members. Megan has led initiatives to influence policy, mobilize resources, and build meaningful cross-sector partnerships. And our third speaker is Dr. Valerie Percival, an associate professor and associate director of the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. Her research focuses on the political impact of violence against civilians, the gender dimensions of health systems, rebuilding health systems after war, and the global backlash against gender equality. So this is a terrific panel. We're just delighted that you all could join us, and thank you for that. And really looking forward to what you're going to say with and the discussions today. In terms of process, there will be 3 at least and possibly 4 rounds in which I will invite our panelists to speak. And then we'll open up to Q&A. Please place your questions and comments in the Q&A section. Round 1 will be a short statement on your take of the cuts and their implications. Round 2, longer presentations. I think there are some slides involved here, which is very good, of your assessment of the cuts and your organization's responses to them. Round 3 is really a question of why health? Especially at a time when USAID has been dismantled, and Canada has strong civil society capacity in health in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. And round four really will be about what Canadians can do. What is your ask to the government, and what kind of support are you seeking from the Canadian public? All right, so let's get started. It's my pleasure to invite Darren first to give a brief take on the cuts and their implications, and then we'll go to the other speakers. So please, Darren.
Thank you, Ted, and thank you so much for having me here today. So, as you mentioned, my name is Darren. Cooperation Canada, for those of us who are maybe a little bit less familiar, is the network of Canadian organizations involved in international development and humanitarian assistance. We sit at about, right now, our membership has been steadily growing. We sit at about 107 members on December 5th. And very diversified membership that really support us in a lot of ways. And one of the ways that they do support us is by supporting us in our budget advocacy and our reaction to Budget 2025, in which in partnership with CanWaCH we signed. We had over 100 signatories in that reaction, and you can find that both on Cooperation Canada and CanWaCH's websites. But to really get into the budget, I think one of the things that we can mostly agree on is that the sector can agree on is really that this budget does mark a real turning point. I think that, at a moment of historical kind of global instability, we're seeing conflict, food insecurity, climate shocks, growing authoritarianism, declining trust in multilateralism, declining civic space. Canada really has chosen to reduce its international assistance by 2.7 billion over 4 years. That is a choice that it has made. And it seems in this environment that it is not the time to retreat. Looking at how this is a turning point, it really signals a significant shift in how it sees the role of international assistance and its international role. It's likely one of the biggest contractions in Canada's international cooperation engagement since probably the 1990s. And, that was an experience that, showed us that rebuilding the trust that was lost then was very expensive and cost a lot more than maintaining it. And so this is not just, sometimes we might get a little bit bogged down in the numbers, but it's not just a financial decision. It really is a strategic one. And for Canadians, that means, for Canada and for Canadians, that means, less global influence, fewer trade opportunities, and a more unsafe world. And importantly, it means a step backwards in terms of the commitments that this government and previous ones have made. But mainly, it means that it breaks Prime Minister Carney's election commitment not to cut foreign aid that he made during the election campaign. So that would be my first point. My second point that I'm going to get into a little bit more during with a PowerPoint presentation is that these cuts are disproportionate in terms of total fiscal savings, and they are poorly explained in terms of transparency. And the third thing that I want to make the point on right now is that this should and it does matter for Canadians. It matters because it cuts into things that Canadians really value and care about, which is a safer world, a more prosperous global economy, including Canada's economy, and a Canada that keeps its words and upholds its values through its actions and its financial commitments. So I'll stop here for now, and then I'll get into it in the second round.
Great. Thank you so much. Megan.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for the invitation to join today's conversation. It's such a pleasure and a privilege to be sharing this sort of virtual stage with all of you, and thank you, Ted, for the kind introduction. As mentioned, I'm Megan, and I serve as the Director of Policy and Partnerships at the Canadian Partnership for Women and Children's Health. That I like to think a little bit as a sister organization to Cooperation Canada, but with some marked differences. We are a coalition of about 114 organizations working all from different entry points, but in the aim to advance the health and rights of women, children, and adolescents all around the world. And we're meeting this morning on a very cold, if you're in the Ottawa region, moment that feels especially urgent. As already Ted and Darren have spoken to, Canada's last federal budget introduced deep reductions to the international assistance envelope, and quite significantly with a very targeted focus on those reductions coming from Canada's global health programming. And I think when we look at a document like the budget, these decisions can feel a bit abstract when framed as fiscal exercises. But I think what's important to ground us in this morning is that the outcomes are really anything but abstract. And so to sort of help ground in this first round our discussion, I want to offer 3 quick points that feel really essential for understanding what these reductions really mean. And the first point is that these reductions do not fall evenly. They fall first and they fall most sharply on those already facing the steepest obstacles to healthcare. In many communities, even small shifts in funding can mean the difference between access or no access at all. And these are communities where clinics may be hours away, where a community health worker is the only trusted provider of services, or where local women's organizations have stepped in to fill gaps that the system cannot or will not. So we see women facing poverty, adolescent girls navigating stigma, people in remote or conflict-affected areas, and 2S LGBTQ plus people who already face discrimination, unsafe conditions, and limited access to affirming care. These are the people and the populations who lose access the fastest. And so cuts like these do not fall evenly. They widen the distance between those who find care elsewhere and those who simply cannot. And I think the modeling that I'll be able to provide some deeper insight to in the next round really brings this into sharp focus. It shows us exactly what disappears when funds are reduced. Things like safe births, access to contraception, access to routine immunizations, treatment for malnutrition, and the very workers who hold health systems together, funding for their very limited funding for training is lost. And so I think in this first point, I really want to challenge us to not think about these abstract figures in dollars only, because these are not efficiencies being found, but rather lifelines to a right to good health being cut. And the second point, which I think Darren spoke really quite well to, is that when we turn our backs on the most marginalized population, this does not serve to keeping Canadians safe. It actually, in fact, makes us much more vulnerable. When Canada steps out from an already crumbling global health system, this weakened health systems anywhere in the world also weakens preparedness everywhere. We have learned this, although there seems to be a collective amnesia. We learned this just 5 years ago. And so cuts today in budget 2025 leave fragile systems less able to detect outbreaks, contain health crises, and maintain the foundation of human security that Canadians really rely on. And there's a diplomatic cost here as well. Canada has long been seen as a trusted and reliable partner in health, and predictability is part of our credibility. And so when we pull back, it undermines our ability to shape outcomes in key multilateral spaces like the G7 and like the UN. And the third and final point that I'll make in this section is that fiscal pressures are real, And we understand that, but there are smarter and more strategic paths forward. I think it's really clear to me over this past month and working within our membership that no one in civil society is not attuned to the real pressures and challenges that the government faces in this moment and the tough choices that need to be made. And yet, in that context, the evidence is clear that investments in things like global health are among the most effective interventions that we can make. They deliver results. We have seen in the last 20 years massive reductions to maternal mortality and child mortality. Health investments in health strengthen education and economic participation, and they stabilize communities. And so there's a better path forward here. I would challenge Canada to take by protecting core global health investments and align spending with what we know works to provide predictable and multi-year commitments. And I'll stop there. Thanks so much, Ted.
Great. Thank you so much. These are great points and important things for our conversation later. Let's turn to Professor Percival. Val.
Hi, Ted. Thanks very much. And thanks for hosting this and for the initiative and holding this event. And I'm grateful to share with Darren and Megan. So I have 3 quick points to make. It's the peril, the promise, and the reality. So the peril has been highlighted well by Darren and Megan. We're living through a time of turmoil, a time of flux, and I would say a time of fear. And we don't always make the best decisions when we're in a position of fear. Canada, as we know, is facing serious economic threats, and our government is facing kind of a fiscal crisis and a trade crisis. The security lens in Canada is ascendant. So we're seeing foreign policy securitized, and we're seeing security experts really in the driver's seat of foreign policy decision making. Globally, we have humanitarian and development crises. There's a weakness in the multilateral system, huge cuts to global health, all of that. Backlash. I'll be going through some of this in my longer session. And the gains of the last decades are eroding. And our ability to kind of reverse that erosion is precarious, right, in terms of fiscal position, et cetera, and multilateral institutions. The second is the promise. So I think in many ways, though our fiscal position is weak, we have, particularly in the global health community, made incredible advances in the last 20 years. And those advances have been made because of scientists, because of advocates, because of organizations that have networked globally, have come together, brought out the best in each other, worked closely with national organizations, ensured that they supported, not supplanted national organizations, raised the capacity of health professionals in many low-income and middle-income countries, and also in fragile states. We know what works. We have best practices in place. So in many ways, we have this solid foundation in terms of achievements to build on. And we also have seen, while we have backlash against gender equality, I was really pleased to see the G20 women shutdown in Johannesburg, where women protested against the lack of gender equality being center in the G20 discussions and forced that onto the agenda. So I'm hopeful that we'll see that kind of global network of advocacy continuing. In terms of moving forward in this challenging reality, I think that we all need to kind of face up to the fact that development assistance is changing, the landscape is changing. We need to figure out how to make a better case for aid and for humanitarian assistance in an increasingly securitized foreign policy. And we need to also offer the government solutions, how to make things more efficient, more effective, how development agencies can work more effectively together, and also support capacity building more effectively in recipient countries. And I think my take on the cuts to global health was that this is a reflection of chaos in our foreign policy, not necessarily a reflection of a rollback in our commitment to SRHR, gender equality, and health. And so I think that there's room to make kind of concrete policy recommendations that this government hopefully will be in a position to move forward with. So I'll end there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. That's terrific. Before we get into the the longer sessions and presentations by all of you, thank you for those, overviews of your position and your analysis. It really is useful. I just want to say that watching Prime Minister Carney a couple of weeks ago at the G20, when he was welcomed so warmly by Cyril Ramaphosa, there was a lot behind that warmth. And one of the things that was behind that was Canada's advocacy and a lot of aid money that we put in the 1980s, particularly to fight apartheid with people like Cyril Ramaphosa in the labor movement and in civil society. And he remembered. And when if you want to talk about trade, you want to talk about security, you want to talk about multilateralism, you're sitting across from somebody who has benefited from Canadian solidarity. And we have learned from people like Cyril Ramaphosa about civil society and its power. So just to say that, when leaders come to the table, they come with history. And much of that history, often not spoken about, relates to their experience with international assistance and solidarity. So we're in a big game here, as well as looking at our own budget. All right, so now let me ask the speakers. I'm going to do it also in the same sequence. I'm going to invite Darren to make a longer presentation with slides, and then he'll be followed by Megan, and then Val will finish up. But just take your time. We want to hear your detailed analysis of this, and thank you again for those words of overview. Over to you, Darren.
Thanks, Ted. So actually, Megan and I are cooperating on this, and she'll be sharing my slides, and I'll now do the talking. Thanks, Megan, and thanks, Ted.
Okay.
Yeah, and thanks for that example, Ted, about how this world and foreign policy isn't just about transactionalism in the moment. It is about a long-term cooperative approach, and international assistance does contribute heavily to that. So that's a really kind of good example that represents that. All right, so as we get into this presentation, I'm going to try, it is a little bit numbers heavy, but hopefully it'll be clear, and feel free to plop in a question if something isn't clear in terms of numbers or anything else. So the way that it is, as we have mentioned, and many of us have mentioned, we're looking at it cuts to international assistance of $2.7 billion over 4 years, and a return to pre-pandemic levels of assistance. And the way that this will be achieved, according to the budget, is by, and our conversations with finance, is by sunsetting programs. And they have detailed it out the savings in the budget document, and it looks like $470 million next year, ramping up progressively to $861 million by 2028-29, and remaining at that higher level thereafter. just to put it a little bit in perspective, the $2.7 billion cuts, it is the Canadian federal budget is about 480 billion, so almost 500, half a trillion dollars. So 2.7 is almost like a rounding error in the federal budget. But this has immense life-changing consequences for millions of people. So that's just to kind of put it in perspective. And how much these cuts represent is a little bit of a guessing game at this point, because we are a little bit unclear on what the baseline on which they will be putting these cuts is. So we can estimate that it could be 10 or 15 or 20% or more, and our best guesstimate right now is probably around the 12 to 15% range. That's kind of what it represents in terms of international assistance cuts. But I think that it raises the bigger question of transparency. And without a published baseline for the international assistance envelope, the true scale of these cuts remains really impossible to accurately determine. And this is really a transparency gap that we at Cooperation Canada and some others have repeatedly raised. And it's not just about the numbers. The numbers have a lot of meaning in them. Transparency and predictability allow Parliament and stakeholders to really assess whether stated priorities are reflected in actual spending decisions. Clarity is essential for understanding how these shifts will affect Canada's partnerships, economy, and security, in addition to the disruptions of program planning and the ability for communities that really rely on predictable support. Transparency is not a technical detail. It really is a democratic principle. And beyond Canada, I've been approached by some of our, international colleagues that look at Canada's budget, that look specifically this year, to see the direction in which Canada is looking to take its international assistance. So it is a big indicator, but this lack of transparency is quite concerning anyway for Cooperation Canada. On my last point here, I think that we mentioned the the global humanitarian the cuts and the effect on global humanitarian and development needs, but it also comes at a time when resources are being cut across the globe. Some of the biggest contributors to ODA are cutting, such as the US, France, and the UK. Actually, the OECD estimates that in 2025 we'll see a 9 to 17% cuts. So it really comes at a difficult time. So I mentioned on the next slide, the budget mentions a return to pre-pandemic levels, and this is not. It's a little bit misleading in the sense that there is no return to pre-pandemic normal. The world is fundamentally different in many ways, and using 2019 as a benchmark really ignores the current situation that we are living in, the current geopolitical situation, as well as the needs landscape. Just for example, humanitarian needs have almost doubled since 2019. Conflicts in Ukraine, in Sudan, in Gaza, food insecurity, and climate impacts have intensified. Inflation is also a factor here. Returning to, everything is worth 20% less. Every dollar is worth 20% less than it did 5 years ago. And so returning to pre-pandemic levels without considering that, does make a huge difference. So on the next slide, it's just to kind of illustrate a little bit of the trend that has of Canada's international assistance. I'd like to thank here my colleague Brian Tomlinson for putting this together. We worked together on publishing the Canadian Aid Trends report, and so this is from that. And so you can definitely see a bump during the pandemic, and the graph on the right really kind of dissects that a little bit. The green being, I don't know if you can read in there, but the green being support to Ukraine in the international assistance envelope, and that has really and COVID support have driven a lot of the spending peaks. So return to pre-pandemic levels, in theory, removes that, but the government has stated that they will continue to support Ukraine, and reconstruction costs there are estimated to be very high. So there's still a lot of. I just want to kind of illustrate this, that there's a lot of questions that remain for us, and a lot of clarity that remains to be understood. On the next slide, thank you. I think that I want to get into a little bit the impacts of how we see these cuts, right? And I mentioned it a little bit before, and I think we've all mentioned it, but it's going to have a major impact on communities in which Canadian engagement is present. In terms of vaccinating children, in terms of treating diseases and preventing pandemics, in terms of supporting mothers to have safe pregnancies and children to grow up healthy. And these are all fundamentals in creating a safer and more sustainable world. But international assistance is also a strategic foreign policy tool for Canada. And I think that, and I think we've kind of been saying this, but I think that this also talks a little bit to what we were saying earlier about making a better case for aid or for international assistance. I think that this is a point that needs to be made and is important. Foreign policy doesn't work in silos. Development, diplomacy, trade, and defense all work together. And Canada's foreign policy toolkit only functions when all four legs of them are robust and solid. International assistance opens doors. It stabilizes fragile regions, supports democratic governance, strengthens relationships, and builds goodwill that military or trade tools alone cannot do. And all of this is being put to the test when you reduce your financial commitments to international assistance. I think beyond the security argument as well, it does support Canada's trade relationships, which is, of course, a focus of this government. And it does so by protecting Canadian economic interests, improving the business environment for Canadian firms to operate in, and expanding export markets. And so these are all unintended positive consequences of seeking mutual shared prosperity and seeking really what ODA or what international assistance is really meant for, which is poverty eradication. I think the next slide I'll talk about a little bit later. I think that's a later question, so I'll save it. You can stop the presentation. Thanks, Megan. So I just want to end this portion by sorry for the sports analogy, but I feel like these cuts are kind of like a hockey team that tries to save money on salaries by cutting its goalie while keeping its forward and defense. That's kind of what reducing international assistance is like. How do you cut the prevention tool and hoping none of the pucks go through to the goal, right? It's not only risky, it really is short-sighted. But I do want to end on a positive note. I think one of the things that we kind of got out of the budget was the commitment to focus international assistance on countries that need it most is a welcome clarification. I think it signals a renewed emphasis on how we read it anyway, on least developed countries, on fragile context, and really on poverty eradication. And I want to put forward that implementing partners, Canada members, stand ready to work with the government and to turn this commitment into practice and really ensure that the resources reach the communities in which they will have a greatest impact. And I think that as global resources for international assistance really and humanitarian really tighten, Those, like Megan said, those living in vulnerable conditions bear the brunt. And so directing international assistance to people in place that need it most, not only aligned with, our objectives, but really can prevent further setbacks in development gains. So I'll stop here. Thanks for putting up my slides and thanks for the time.
Excellent. Thank you. I think also, given Canada's diverse population, you could also shift that, convert that sports analogy to soccer. And depending on who you talk to, it would resonate, more or less with certain groups of people who love and believe that football is the greatest sport on earth. Plus, the World Cup is coming up soon, so,
Yeah, Ted, you're just on mute, but I live in Toronto, and the hype is real for the World Cup. People are talking about it, but I'm looking outside at snow, and so it feels more like a hockey analogy is relevant at this point.
I think both work. It's terrific. All right. Megan, are you coming in on this round?
I'm coming in on this round with deep gratitude now for Darren to share some slides. And while he does so, I can go ahead and get started. So thanks again. And I want to reflect really, I think Darren gave us this sort of meta overview, and I want to really drill down now into how Canada's leadership in global health was built, how the global context is shifting, and what the current reductions mean for people, systems, and for Canada. And I'll focus on 4 points. Assuming that not everyone is arriving here today who's living and breathing this data, this number, and this story, I want to take us back to Canada's Leadership Foundation in this regard, what the budget really says, the implications for communities, and then the implications for Canadians and global health security at large. And so in the next slide, let me begin by situating us in who CanWaCH is as a coalition. We are a partnership of, as I mentioned, 114 organizations located from coast to coast. And we are a little bit unique in that our membership comprises humanitarian and development NGOs, universities, research institutes, as well as health professional associations. And together, our network is really the Team Canada approach cohort that's working to advance the health and rights of women, children, and adolescents every day across the full continuum of care, from sexual and reproductive health to maternal care to nutrition, immunization, and primary health care. And Canada's ability to lead in these areas is not accidental. And in fact, it's the result of decades of deliberate investment and partnership. And so my first point is that Canada's leadership in women and children's health has been built through consistent cross-government commitments that started in 2010 with the Muskoka Initiative, which was, of course, a landmark global effort. It was launched at the then G8 under Prime Minister Harper and mobilized international action to reduce maternal and child deaths and position Canada as a leader in global health. It was really our first major step into the arena. And the renewal of Muskoka in 2015 really continued that momentum. Of course, shortly thereafter, Canada saw a change in government and the introduction of the Feminist International Assistance Policy. And in that context, and as the Muskoka commitment neared that cliff in 2020, civil society really recognized that we had something unique and special here in Canada, and that we could not lose the progress that had been made to that point. And under the banner of an initiative known as the Thrive Agenda, dozens of organizations across the country mobilized around a bold long-term vision that would not only protect the maternal, newborn, and child health agenda, but also expand that initiative to include access to the full suite of women and girls and gender diverse people's health and rights, and of course, including SRHR specifically. And that brings us to a quite a landmark moment in 2019 when Prime Minister Trudeau responded to that advocacy with the 10-year commitment to global health and rights. And this was really a globally historic pledge because not only did it raise Canada's annual funding to $1.4 billion, it was a decade-long commitment which provided a planning horizon that had not been experienced before in this regard. And it really I want to come back to this important point that it was calibrated in that moment in 2019 to a pre-pandemic context. So across these moments, a really clear pattern emerges, and that Canada's impact has never been just about scale alone, even though our investments have been sizable, but really it's been driven by the clarity and consistency with which we act as a focused and principled middle power. And because of these long-term investments across successive governments, the ecosystem in the global health ecosystem in Canada is really extraordinary. From the NGOs to universities to scientists developing R&D, this ecosystem really has become part of Canada's identity as a reliable and constructive global health partner. And with that foundation in mind, I want to turn to the second point, and this is really about what the federal budget signals about where Canadian leadership stands today. And so if we look at the slide that we have in front of you, you can see that global health has consistently represented a meaningful share of Canada's international assistance envelope over the sort of last 6 years. And that's it shows, we start around 22% in fiscal year 2018, 2019, and start to see that share diminish to about 17%. So the share of the IAE remains consistent, but is diminishing, but you'll see that investments in global health as they ramp up do remain relatively stable. And so I think we start to get at or to unpack some of the inconsistencies with the approach that this budget, that the government has taken under this budget, which I think I just wanted to put on the next slide, the very specific language as it relates to global health in budget 2025. And of course, this is in the global affairs section on page 305. And I'll just read so that the very specific reference, which is, as part of these adjustments, there will be reductions in development funding to global health programming, where Canada's contribution has grown disproportionately relative to other similar economies. And then it goes on to the other areas in which they are also seeking to find savings. And there are three implications from my vantage point. First, global health being directly targeted, not trimmed, is being directly targeted, not trimmed alongside other interventions. Second, the claim that contributions grew disproportionately relative to other economies just is sort of fundamentally inaccurate as we start to look at our share, let's say, of big global health initiatives like the Global Fund and Gavi. Actually, we come in quite accurately in quote unquote our fair share. And third, this notion that returning to a pre-pandemic baseline, it just, as Darren spoke to, it just does not reflect today's global realities. And I think we need to remind them that the 10-year commitment announced in 2019 was in fact already calibrated to a pre-pandemic international assistance envelope. And I think as Dr. Percival spoke to in her opening remarks, these cuts come at such a time of upheaval in the global health system. Health services and health systems already remained extremely strained. after the COVID-19 pandemic. Preventable diseases are trending in the wrong direction. Things like gender-based violence and the health implications of that are on the rise. And the World Health Organization is estimating that in low and middle income countries, just to provide the most basic of health packages, that there's about $100 billion shortfall right now. And so this brings me on the next slide to the third point. And this is really what these reductions mean in real terms for communities, because budgets do not, as I mentioned, cut programs in the abstract, but they cut services that people rely on every day. And I just wanted to do a little bit of modeling to sort of ground us that if we imagine that, for every $100 million that we reduce from Canada's 10-year commitment or global health funding, what the potential programmatic impacts can be. And they're listed on this slide, and they're things like 1.5 million antenatal visits lost, up to between 120,000 and 200,000 births not performed in the presence of a skilled attendant. 3.9, this is from the Guttmacher modeling, but 3.9 million women and adolescents would lose access to contraception for a whole year, which results in 1.7 million unintended pregnancies and 550,000 unsafe abortions no longer averted. And so I think this slide really demonstrates that when we talk about reductions to budget, and I really am uncomfortable with the term savings, because I think what this slide demonstrates is that these are not savings, but they represent the loss of services and that keep families alive. Which leads to the fourth and final point, and this is the implications for Canadians themselves on the next slide, please, particularly through the lens of global health security. And that these cuts have consequences for Canadians in such concrete and tangible ways. We know so well that disease outbreaks move faster than borders, that move faster than any political system. And when fragile systems lose the capacity to detect outbreaks, maintenance of surveillance, and deliver routine immunization, the risk to Canadians very in real time increases. And so investments in strong primary health systems abroad are among some of the most cost-effective ways that we can keep Canadians safe. And we also know, as we saw just a few years ago, that outbreaks, as they spread, can disrupt trade and global supply chains that Canadians and the Canadian economy really depend on. And so reducing Canada's global health footprint during this period of rising infectious disease, climate-driven emergencies, and a very weakened global surveillance system ultimately weakens our own preparedness and our own resilience. So I think as we look ahead, the question is simply not about what is being reduced, but what kind of leadership Canada chooses to exercise in this moment. Canada's leadership up until this point in global health was built with a real degree of intentionality. It was built on evidence, it was built through partnership, and it was built on the understanding that the health and rights of women and children are really central to global stability. And so I think that in this moment, there's an opportunity to protect that leadership. But doing so requires holding steady and recognizing that fiscal pressures are not a reason to step back, and they are a call for more strategic and a more committed engagement from our government. And I'll stop there. Thank you so much, Ted.
Thank you very much. Very strong presentation and analysis. And I know our next speaker is going to have more to say about this. She's been working on these issues. Just let me make two points, one macro and one very micro. The macro one is that with the dismantling of USAID, which was the biggest by far funder of global health externally in developing countries, there's a vacuum. The Gates Foundation, which might have filled some of this is very busy with many different needs and trying to fulfill issues around immunization and many other areas. Um, if there ever was a time for Canada to step up, this is it. It's not. So you're asking the wrong question. Our decision makers are asking questions of internal and comparative analysis with other economies, when in fact, I think, as you're both saying, Darren and Megan, that the need is very serious, and the opportunity for leadership has never been greater. So this is not a genius cut. This is a very kind of provincial way of thinking about your own, a defensive way of thinking about your own interests, and that's not good enough for us. If we want to be a serious middle power again, we have to think about other people. The micro point is, and this is, it is a very micro point, but a lot of the health system work is downloaded onto community health workers, and they're not getting paid in many cases. In fact, they're subsidizing the whole system with their labor, and often at some sacrifice. So when you start pulling money out of those budgets when they're not even getting enough to begin with, you're doing something that is, I would say, irresponsible. I mean, these are people who are the last line of defense, who save lives. And so I think we have to put those people's interests at the center of this set of decisions as well. Anyway, let's move now to Val Percival, who's been working on these issues around health from some really interesting angles. And over to you, Val.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ted. And I just wanted, before I start my PowerPoint, I just wanted to continue the sports analogy and maybe reflect on the fact that these cuts in many ways are an own goal, right? We had an opportunity at a moment when you're seeing, as I mentioned, as everybody's mentioned, turmoil, disruption, to at least hold the line and to exercise leadership, not only in development assistance. I think one of the things that is often underreported about the budget is the broader cuts to Global Affairs Canada. So not only are you seeing cuts to the international assistance envelope, you're going to see a much lighter diplomatic footprint in many places that where a lot of crises are happening. And I've seen firsthand, we've all seen firsthand how Canadian diplomats, Canadian members of civil society really can move the needle. Using very limited amounts of resources, they can make improvements in terms of negotiating peace agreements, negotiating humanitarian access, all of those things. And it adds to our soft power and to our credibility has been mentioned around the world. So let me just share my presentation. I'll try and go through it quickly because we're kind of running out of time for questions. So we know it's a bad day when you start with a quote from an Italian Marxist who was writing this in prison in the 1930s. So the old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. So I'm sure many of you have seen this quote making its rounds, but I think it's quite an apt quote. I wanted to put some of Canada's cuts to humanitarian and development assistance and diplomacy in context. So this is data from the Uppsala conflict analysis program, and it shows state-based conflicts by region. So we're seeing an escalation in the number of state-based conflicts, and we're seeing, although a lot of attention has been paid, quite understandably, to the horrific conflict in Gaza, but you can see Africa, Sudan. Things are not going well in terms of conflict around the world. We're at the highest levels since World War II. And the UN, in its Sustainable Development update, provided some data that armed conflicts from 2023 to 2024 armed conflict killed one person every 12 minutes, and there was a steep rise in fatalities among women and children. We know that as a result of this armed conflict, or perhaps driving this armed conflict, we're seeing a dramatic increase in military expenditures. So this is from the Stockholm Institute of Peace Research, SIPRI, and you see the dramatic increase in 2024, and that's only going to go up in 2025. So global military spending reached a record high, $2.7 trillion in 2024. And one of the things that we're also seeing is that we're just watching that happen. There's no pushback. There's no, domestically, it's like, oh, 5% GDP. Of course, we need to spend 5% GDP on our military. Why not? And there's just no room for debate within within our foreign policy. And our policy, as has been discussed, is becoming increasingly securitized. So we have this Canada strong, Canada strong, Canada strong everywhere, securing Canada. And our foreign policy main two priorities are economic resilience and defense and security, with this kind of third plank of values where they've put democracy, gender equality, human rights, etc., without really any explanation of how that will be implemented. I think one thing that I want to highlight is that when you securitize foreign policy, what that means is that the people that are sitting around the decision-making table tend to be from the security community, and they have an important role in our society. And I don't want to dismiss that role that they have, but they can't be the only voices at the table. And security frameworks, their reference point is the state. It's not necessarily humanity or individuals. Their time horizons are very short term. So they focus on short-term gains. They don't really look at kind of long-term relationships, like the kind of thing that Ted was mentioning about, our support to the fight against apartheid and how that's still paying dividends even now. Security experts also divide the world into us and them, friends and enemies. They focus on the symptoms, not the drivers of threats and conflict. And their objective is really to protect, to deter threats, not really to prevent conflicts or to promote peace. And they tend to lack an understanding of diplomacy, and the critical role of soft power, things like development aid. And I think that it's important to recognize that, particularly for countries like Canada, how we relate to the world is through our soft power. It's through our development assistance. It's through our diplomacy. It's not necessarily through our military and our security. In terms of the broader cuts, Darren mentioned this figure in his presentation, but I think it's worth kind of repeating that official development assistance from the broader community of donors is going down. So there is estimates that it will be the first time in 30 years that ODA is set to fall amongst the major donors for 2 years in a row. And I think the donors that are holding firm are Norway and Japan, but many other donors are also making deep cuts. And so Canada's cuts to our development assistance unfortunately joins this broader trend. We know that the least developed countries and sub-Saharan Africa are the places that are going to face the steepest cuts. And we know that those are the places that have the least resilience in terms of being able to buttress those cuts. Oops, sorry. There we go. I need to go back to the health one. It's a little jittery. So, official development assistance for health is projected to decline and to fall. You can see these two estimates from the OECD The lower cut and higher cut, the range is between 13 and 25% of official development assistance. There have been some global models that have been done, and a preprint it just came up in the Lancet of a group of scholars that predicts in excess of 9.4 million to 22.6 million deaths in low-income and middle-income countries by 2030. If these cuts are continued. And I think one of the things that is important to remember about health is that it's quickly reversible. So one of the reasons why health is such a great entry point for development assistance is that you can quickly improve health outcomes, particularly for infectious diseases. And so you can invest money and quickly see gains. But the same is true if you reduce that spending. And so there is a real risk that with lack of access to things like tuberculosis medication, malaria drugs, bed nets, HIV, maternal health care, that you're going to see a real dramatic increase in morbidity and mortality. And behind all of those statistics is really lost human potential. And I think that's something that we tend to forget, that those are people that could have gone on to live healthy, fulfilling lives and contributed to their community, and gone on and done wonderful things. And instead, because of these cuts, you're seeing that those lives lost needlessly in many cases. There also is this narrative that this isn't a bad thing, right? Cuts to development assistance, it's okay because this will force the countries in the global south to really get serious about investing money in their own health systems. And I think that there is a kernel of truth to that. I think that some countries, particularly middle-income countries, need to face pressure from their populations to invest in their health systems and in healthcare. But I think one thing that a lot of those commentators are ignoring is that the global south is facing a really unprecedented debt burden in many ways. And this is a slide from the UN Mission on Trade and Development, and it shows that in many places, countries are spending more on interest than they are on health and education. And so this really begs the question of how countries that are facing this level of debt can possibly step up and invest in those health systems themselves. And I'd also like to just mention that the G20 had debt on their agenda in Johannesburg, and they didn't really reach any meaningful agreement on how countries could come together and really address this debt crisis. And I would also say that Canada was deeply disappointing in terms of its G7 agenda. And if you went back 10 years ago to when Canada, oh, I guess it was longer than that. I'm dating myself. 20 years ago when Jean Chrétien hosted I guess it was 8 at that time in Kananaskis in the same location. That agenda was squarely focused on Africa, on debt relief, and it happened after 9/11 at a similar point of global turmoil and disruption. And Canada at that moment chose to exercise leadership and galvanize action. And we didn't do so in terms of our own G7 agenda, and we didn't contribute to that in the G20. So I'd also just like to emphasize that we're seeing a real pushback against gender equality, against rights for LGBTQ. And this backlash is real. We're seeing increased violence against these communities. We're seeing a rollback in terms of criminalization of behaviors, putting people's lives at risk, and we're seeing a real rollback in reproductive rights. And we're also seeing a normalization of things like, oh, teenage pregnancy, early marriage in some of the narratives that are coming out of some of the commentators. And I think we need to hold the line in terms of gender equality and point to the tremendous gains that have been made in the past couple of decades. One of the things that I think that we need to do is show, in terms of thinking about the problem of development assistance and making the case for development assistance, we need to really show how and why improvements to economic and social development impact on peace and economic stability and economic outcomes. And this is some research that we did. It came out in 2023. It was a Lancet commission, and it showed that increases in health equity and gender equality had led to meaningful improvements in peace and security. The other thing that it showed was that that when countries fell back in terms of health equity and gender equality, that they risked getting trapped in cycles of violence and conflict. And so I think that we need to think about how do we frame the importance of social and economic development to decision makers in a current environment where we have a securitization of foreign policy, where we have narratives of Canada strong that can resonate with the way that they view the world, and that can show that these investments can move the needle, I guess, in terms of security and peace in the short term as well as in the long term. So in terms of our foreign policy and where we are, I think that we have a government that is very ambitious in terms of its nation building exercise, but it lacks clarity and ambition in terms of its development assistance. It doesn't seem to really know what it's doing. Ted talked about how warmly Prime Minister Carney was welcomed by President Ramaphosa in South Africa. And I watched Prime Minister Carney's press conference, and I thought it was really interesting because he began that press conference by talking about Brian Mulroney and his commitment to the fight against apartheid. Then in the question and answer period, when he was pressed on his commitment to the Africa strategy, he talked about how his government was prioritizing, the economic security of Canada, and that meant that it was focusing on areas of highest return. So places like Mexico, places like the Indo-Pacific region, and implying that Africa was not necessarily one of those places of high returns on his time or investment. And the contrast was so stark because, at the time that Prime Minister Mulroney was making his efforts to fight apartheid, I'm not sure that he was motivated by returns on his investment, and yet it had these significant diplomatic knock-on effects for decades afterwards. And so I think that we're at a period where there's a lot of flux, and I think these are the kinds of conversations that are really important to talk about where development is at, why it's important, and to do so in a way that is realistic, but also to ensure that the security community isn't the one that is in the driver's seat of those conversations. So, I've seen lots of commentary from military experts and security experts about development's place in the Canadian foreign policy landscape. But I think that we need more development experts providing that commentary on those national stages. So as one of the things that we did here at NIPSIA in the spring, concerned about the lack of that discussion on Canada's role in low income and fragile states. We developed, we brought together some stakeholders and held some consultations to come up with a report that's called Moving the Needle. And we really developed this kind of framework for Canada's development and humanitarian engagement. And the idea of this was just to put it out there as a way to start the conversation, not as necessarily the end all and the be all. But we divided it up into kind of what our principles should be, what our goals should be, how we can achieve those goals, what we need to do to be more effective, et cetera. Suggested priorities in that kind of landscape, and then some suggested signature initiatives. So a couple things that I'll highlight. We really focused on the importance of a Team Canada approach. We tried to, in the report, emphasize that there are lots of ways that we could make our current aid budget. We didn't want cuts to aid budget, but our current aid budget stretch a little bit further. We definitely needed a bureaucracy that got it done. We needed diplomats to be more risk acceptant and to really use their postings to actually move the needle when they're and seek out opportunities for Canada to make a difference. We wanted Canada to focus on constructively on how to engage in multilateral reform. And also, we reflected on the importance of partnerships and consortiums. And I guess I'll just conclude with kind of a call from the research community. I think one of the things that characterizes the Canadian development landscape different from other places that I've worked, so I worked in Sweden and the UK, is that there isn't as much engagement, I think, between researchers and the government and civil society. And I think at this moment, we need to all come together. We need big tent kind of discussions where we welcome people that have diverse perspectives and really push together for the government to exercise more meaningful engagement in fragile contexts and low income contexts, because this is really an opportunity, as has been mentioned, for Canada to show leadership and to hopefully move the needle in small but meaningful ways. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. In fact, there was a question around security and peace for you, which you answered with your presentation. So I just want to say that you're taken together, your presentations make a very strong case from many angles for rolling these cuts back to a reasonable level, if I could put it that way. And just to build on the sports analogy, either hockey or soccer, but we may not have a choice at the moment in changing the head coach, but we can certainly change the assistant coaches, both in ministries and also in the bureaucracy. And this is not particularly edifying decision making on their part. We have a few minutes. I'm going to keep my eye on the chat and the Q&A and bring in questions. But for now, just let me, and you've all spoken about health very eloquently and mobilized some data on this. On the specific issue of sexual and reproductive health and rights, we know that there's support for that in parts of Latin America, in Europe, and certainly in parts of Asia, in fact. But we also know that there's an organized campaign against this through masculinized populism coming out of the current U.S. administration, but also in other parts of the world, including Russia and other places. Let me ask you all if you could just speak quickly to what Canada's role is. I think I heard before we started that there's some openness in the government to see this as a comparative advantage. But let's start with you, Megan, and then over to Darren and then Val on this question.
I think to Dr. Percival's point, the challenge that we have within the global system is often when we're talking about at the state level, it's state to state interactions, or it's programming in country through implementing partners. And I think what's unique, and there's a tendency, especially in moments of crisis, to go to those issues that have the most sort of consensus around them. And we know without question that the most politicized issue is in fact sexual and reproductive health and rights. And we're seeing that play out worldwide in our own country, in places like Alberta and New Brunswick and others, right? Certainly south of the border. And so what role does Canada play? Well, firstly, as it stands right now, we are one of the largest donors from a size. This is one area where the scale of our investment does in fact put us as a leader. And we've seen other donors like the UK and like France start to take a step back. There's some Nordic countries, of course, still standing strong, but an already very small donor pool is even smaller in this moment. And so, in fact, both Canadian leadership but Canadian investments are more critical than ever. But what this means is that it's a much more difficult issue to integrate into a foreign policy approach where Canada is in fact trying to make friends with other governments where such policies and programs are not popular. And I think that this is the moment where actually Canada, if in fact we have a 3-pillar foreign policy and values is one of those pillars, this is one area where it's so clear to me that Canada can really walk the talk. And we do so by programming differently. And I think while issues at the political level are in fact contentious as they relate to women's bodies and their ability to make decisions about them, there are actors in every country around the world who are fighting this fight on the front line, whether that be youth-led organizations, women's rights organizations, 2S LGBTQ plus organizations. And what Canada's role in this moment of immense attack is resourcing those organizations. They know what is needed that is specific to the context in which they are operating, and they know how to deliver services to the people and the communities that need them most. And so my plea is that through funding commitments like the 10-year commitment, through Women's Voice and Leadership, that we continue to fund those movements, because we know that the right is better resourced and better organized than the progressive side of this fight. And I think Canada really has a consequential role to play in that regard.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Val, would you like to add something quickly on this?
Sure. I think I agree with Megan 100%. I think what I would suggest from a foreign policy perspective is that we be more careful. So we have been accused of being preachy. And I think that, one of the reasons, I didn't mention it, one of the reasons in the Moving the Needle report that we didn't say, we suggested that Canada not explicitly have the kind of the feminist in its development policy, was because I think that we might be more effective at a time of turmoil and backlash by quietly holding the line and being strategic in terms of how we connect with those people who know who to access and what to do. And we might actually be more effective and make sure that they're not put in danger. So I think that I as a backlash researcher, I've changed my position a little bit on this, and I think that being smart and strategic at this moment is absolutely critical. We are seeing this rollback, and we need to ensure that that we hold the line, but don't make things more difficult and dangerous for people that are on the ground.
I think that's very wise tactically, even though some of the preachiest people are the Marco Rubios and the Hegseths and so on, but those are our neighbors. Okay, let me go to the chat. There is a question, and it brings us back to the question of debt relief that we have discussed here. I think Val and others around constraining the abilities of developing countries to respond to health and development needs. And so this is a question on noting that the UN Conference on Financing Development held in Seville late June recommended reducing excessive sovereign debt burdens and mobilizing domestic resources as two potentially very powerful tools for financing, but not just domestic resources, but reducing the debt burden as well. So the question really is from the participant here, how should donor countries, including Canada, work with developing country partners, particularly the poorest, to reduce their debts to sustainable levels, improve their taxation systems, and expand their public development banks? So to be transparent, this is an interest of the Group of 78. Our colleague Roy Culpepper has taken a leading role on this issue in his own research. We're very interested in pursuing this issue coming out of our conference in October. So maybe start on this one with Darren and then move to Val and Megan. Darren, would you like to weigh in on this?
Sure. I think I may have missed part of it. My internet wasn't doing so well, but if I understand correctly, it's around kind of debt cancellation or debt sustainability.
Yeah.
I think that I'm going to make only one point on this. So as you mentioned in my intro, I was Sherpa of the C7 of the Civil 7, which is a G7 an official G7 engagement group, and one of our working groups, or one of the priority thematics that we were working on, that I was not leading, but that our coordinators were working on, was economic justice, and we had some global civil society leaders working on economic justice, and they put forward a lot of recommendations. But one that really stood out for me, and I think that was one of the most important ones, was that there's a big chunk of civil society that is really looking to, Dr. Percival mentioned it about the G20, but is really looking to have that debt sustainability framework not be led by the G20, but by the UN. And I think that is something that Canada can champion and move forward, is that, if it's led by the G20 and it's led by global creditors, it might not have the same, democratic democracy embedded into it as if it's led by the UN. So that's one thing that I would say that Canada can try to move forward and use its voice to do, is to move that framework from the G20 to the UN.
Thank you. Val, would you like to comment on this?
I'll just add, 2 quick points. This isn't my area of research, and I'm not an economist, so I'll put those qualifiers out there first. I think I agree with the importance of multilateral institutions like the UN leading this, but I do think that the G7 and the G20, because of the political nature of those organizations, having them sign on and actually acknowledge that debt is a huge problem and is impacting on economic and social development would be incredibly important. And I think that Canada can play a role. Also, I would also argue in institutions like the IMF, right? So we need to have, I think, ensure that we acknowledge the seriousness of the debt issue with action, not just words.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Megan, anything on this one?
Not, I also, this is not my area of expertise by any stretch, but I think one thing that I'd just like to put a sharp point on is that in this context of resource scarcity, of reduced ODA that I think we heard globally, there's this quest by our government and others for a silver bullet of like what, if I need to hear private finance mobilization one more time as the thing that's going to lead us through this. I think that though the issue that's raised here is it is part of the silver bullet. It is how we structurally solve this problem. And we just seem to lack global political will to really have the depth of conversations required. So that's all that I would add to that. Thanks, Ted.
Okay. Thank you. I want to say a couple things. One is we do have to wrap up shortly. You have collectively and individually put forward really strong cases, both against these cuts and also what could happen, what would be better, and what happens when international development is funded. And I think we all need to work harder on the issue of making the case, on the issue of presenting everything from, leaders who have come to the table. By the way, President Lula of Brazil was also somebody who was deeply involved in NGO solidarity when he was a labor leader and in his earlier terms and even now. So you've got that. Very important. And both those leaders, Ramaphosa and Lula, work in the BRICS platform as well as through the G20 and the UN. They're very strong multilateralists and, have been incubated in a sense as leaders in civil society. So I think that's important. But I hope that you will be able to take some of this material into parliamentary committees and find its way to opinion pieces. And if you want an agent, I'll be your agent for TV interviews. I think you should do more of those, all of you, and take it to the people who made these decisions, which are essentially really dumb. Thank you again. There's been on the chat lots of acknowledgement and appreciation of your work and there's an interest in having access to the recording and to your slides. And I would, we will do, as long as all of you agree, we will make all of that available to members and to others in our respective networks. So you've done a great job today. Thank you so much. Thanks to everybody for being on this call. And let's keep working on this issue.
Thank you, Ted.
Thank you very much.
Take care,
Take
everyone.
care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.